Somewhere around 4,500 years ago, the male family lines of an entire continent started disappearing. Not slowly either. In parts of Bronze Age Iberia, researchers comparing ancient genomes found that within a window of roughly 400 years, every single Y chromosome lineage present before that window was gone, replaced entirely by a new one. Across the wider migration behind it, the best current estimates put the ratio at somewhere between 5 and 14 new men arriving for every one new woman. Do the math on that ratio across a few centuries of repeated contact, and the local male population effectively gets erased, while the women largely remain. The people responsible left no writing and built nothing resembling a city. Just burial mounds, wagons, and a language that, one way or another, roughly half the planet now speaks. This is not a story that needed exaggeration to become one of the largest population turnovers documented in the human genetic record. It just needed someone to finally check the DNA. The clearest single data point comes from Iberia. A study led by geneticist Inigo Olalde examined the Bronze Age transition on the peninsula and found that while only about 40% of the region's total ancestry changed hands during this period, the Y chromosome picture was far more extreme. Every male lineage detected before the transition was absent afterward, a complete turnover on the paternal side layered on top of a much smaller shift in overall ancestry. That kind of gap, most of the general ancestry staying put while essentially all of the male lineages vanish, only makes sense if incoming men were having children with local women at a scale the reverse almost never happened. Iberia is not a small or marginal test case either. It covers what is now Spain and Portugal, a region that had already supported farming communities for thousands of years before this transition began. Communities with their own established territory, their own burial customs, and, presumably, their own men defending all of it. The broader pattern across Bronze Age Europe backs this up. In 2017, a team led by Amy Goldberg compared ancestry on the X chromosome, which women carry 2 copies of and men carry 1, against ancestry on the regular chromosomes, which both sexes carry equally. The gap between those two numbers works out mathematically to somewhere between 5 and 14 migrating men for every migrating woman during the steppe expansion into Central Europe. That estimate has not gone unchallenged. A separate team argued the statistical method used could be biased by small reference samples, and Goldberg's group responded with a corrected estimate, still landing at 4 to 7 men per woman after accounting for the critique. Every version of the analysis points the same direction. Incoming men were replacing local men at a rate far beyond ordinary population mixing. This is a different, later event from an older, considerably more ancient global Y chromosome bottleneck, dated to roughly 5,000 to 7,000 years ago and tied to early farming societies broadly, covered elsewhere. What happened in Bronze Age Europe has its own name, its own timeline, and its own mechanism. The math behind it is straightforward. If a migration were simply 2 populations meeting and mixing in roughly equal proportions, total ancestry and Y chromosome ancestry should move by about the same amount. In Iberia, they did not. General ancestry moved by around 40%, while paternal lineage moved by effectively all of it. That gap is what you get when incoming men are systematically outcompeting local men for reproductive success across generations, whether through violence, social dominance, resource control, or some combination of all three. To understand who did this, you have to go looking on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast belt of grassland stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian, a landscape with no forests, no walls, and functionally no limit on how far a herd, and the people following it, could travel. Archaeologists call the people who lived there the Yamnaya, pastoralists who lived off cattle and sheep rather than farming fixed plots the way most of Neolithic Europe did. Critically, they were also the first people in this story with the means to move an entire household, not just themselves, across enormous distances at once. Their burials give this away immediately. Kurgans, large earthen burial mounds filled with wagons, weapons, and sacrificed animals, dot the landscape from the Black Sea steppe all the way into Central Europe, each one visible from a considerable distance in otherwise flat, open terrain. A single mound, raised over a single grave, was itself a statement in a landscape with almost no other permanent structures at all. This was a leader, it said, and this ground now belongs to that memory. The first formal description of a Yamnaya grave came in 1901 from Russian archaeologist Vasily Gorodzov, working in what is now Ukraine. He noted the distinctive ochre staining, the wagon burials, and the mounds, and recognized them as something different from the farming cultures further west. For most of the 20th century, though, that recognition went nowhere. The Yamnaya left no writing and no cities, which made them easy to file away as just another prehistoric culture among many, especially once mainstream archaeology, wary of the political misuse migration theories had suffered earlier in the century, settled into a working assumption often summarized as POTS, not people. Culture spreads through contact and imitation, not through actual population movement. That assumption held for decades, right up until ancient DNA sequencing became viable. In 2015, a team led by Wolfgang Hock compared genomes from Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age steppe herders, and modern Europeans, and found that late Neolithic corded ware people in Germany derived roughly 75% of their ancestry from Yamnaya steppe populations. The genetic signature of Europe's earlier farmers had not blended gradually. In evolutionary terms, it had been largely overwritten within a few thousand years. POTS, not people, as a working assumption, did not survive contact with the data. The material culture backs this up too, once you know what you are looking at. Corded ware sites across northern Europe and bell beaker sites further west had long been treated as largely separate, locally developed traditions, connected at most by trade or shared fashion. Testing the genomes found both were saturated with steppe ancestry, meaning the underlying population behind these supposedly distinct archaeological cultures was, to a significant degree, the same expanding group wearing different regional pottery styles. The old model of independent local cultures slowly influencing each other collapsed once the genomes were actually compared side by side. The sex-specific pattern is where this story gets strange, and where the paternal and maternal lines of ancient Europe tell two different stories about the same event. Y chromosome DNA, passed only from father to son, shows an overwhelming steppe signature after this period. Mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, shows far more continuity with the farming populations that were already there beforehand. Incoming men were having children with local women at scale. Local men, for the most part, were not. That asymmetry left a permanent mark. The two most common paternal haplogroups in Europe today, a term geneticists use for a family of related Y chromosome lineages sharing a common ancestor, are R1b in the west and R1a further east, both tracing directly back to Yamnaya ancestry. In parts of Western Europe, including Ireland and Spain, R1b shows up in a clear majority of men tested. R1a follows a similar pattern further east, dominant across much of Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. Put another way, if you are a man of European descent, there is a real chance the Y chromosome you carry has been on this migration before you were even a possibility. What actually drove that asymmetry is debated rather than settled. It could reflect direct violence against local men. It could reflect steppe groups arriving already organized around large, socially dominant patrilineal clans, family structures built around a shared male bloodline that simply outcompeted and absorbed smaller farming communities over generations, without every encounter being a massacre. Polygyny, high-status men fathering children with multiple women, could also compound the effect over time even without outright violence. The archaeological and genetic record supports the scale of the replacement far more confidently than it supports any single explanation for the mechanism behind it. Some of the advantages behind this expansion are well supported. Researchers analyzing isotopes in Yamnaya skeletons have found a diet consistently rich in meat and dairy, in contrast to the grain-heavy diet of Neolithic farming communities. Steppe skeletons also measure taller on average than the farmers they replaced in several studies, though the exact figures vary by site and have not been independently confirmed against one specific source here. So treat the height gap as a real but approximate pattern rather than a precise number. Horses, though not domesticated by the Yamnaya themselves, since that innovation traces further east to sites in Kazakhstan around 3500 BCE, were clearly integrated into steppe life by the late 4th millennium BCE, based on bit wear found on horse teeth and residue suggesting mare's milk was already part of the diet. Even without full cavalry warfare, a mounted group could scout, herd, and move at a pace no farming community on foot could match or predict. One popular claim does not hold up: the idea that Yamnaya migrants already carried widespread genetic tolerance for milk in adulthood, sometimes offered as an explanation for their dietary edge. Multiple independent ancient DNA studies have found the opposite. The lactase persistence allele was nearly absent in Yamnaya genomes and in the earliest corded ware populations that descended from them, typically found in under 5% of individuals sampled. It did not become common in Europe until roughly 1,000 years or more after this migration, during the later Bronze and Iron Ages. Whatever dietary advantage the Yamnaya had, and the isotope evidence for a richer diet is real, it came from meat and animal fat, not from drinking milk without consequence. Disease may have played a role too, though the direction of causation here is unclear. Researchers extracting ancient DNA directly from the teeth of Neolithic farmers have confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind plague, circulating through densely settled farming communities in the centuries surrounding this migration. This early strain appears to have spread differently than the later, flea-borne plague most people associate with the term, likely transmitting directly between people in crowded conditions rather than through fleas and rats. Dense, sedentary villages, exactly the kind Neolithic farmers lived in, are precisely the setting where a pathogen like that spreads efficiently and repeatedly. Smaller, more mobile pastoralist groups, spread thin across open grassland rather than packed into permanent settlements, may simply have been harder to infect at the same scale. Whether the Yamnaya arrived into populations already weakened by disease, or contributed to spreading it further as they moved through already vulnerable communities, remains an open question. This ancestry also came with a real biological cost, not just advantages. A 2024 study led by William Berry, published in Nature, found that genetic variants raising the risk of multiple sclerosis were under active positive selection specifically in steppe pastoralist populations, likely because the same immune variants offered some protection against pathogens common in a herding lifestyle. Modern Europeans with a higher proportion of steppe ancestry carry a measurably higher genetic risk for the disease as a direct, traceable consequence. Every advantage this population carried into Europe appears to have come bundled with a cost that outlasted them by thousands of years. The Yamnaya left no writing behind, and yet a language connected to them is estimated to be spoken, in one descendant form or another, by more than 3 billion people alive today. The connection was first noticed in the 18th century, when the British scholar Sir William Jones observed that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin shared structural and vocabulary similarities, too consistent to be coincidence, pointing toward a shared ancestral language linguists now call Proto-Indo-European. Reconstructing that vocabulary gives a fairly direct window into who spoke it, and even helps date them. Words for wheel, axle, wagon, and yoke show up as shared, reconstructible terms across nearly every branch of the language family, which only works if the people speaking the ancestral language already had wheeled transport before the family split apart, placing the origin of the language after wheels existed and pointing toward the same mobile, technologically capable culture the archaeology already describes. Words for guest, oath, and chieftain suggest a society organized around hierarchy, loyalty, and formal social obligation, concepts detailed enough to need their own dedicated vocabulary. Religious language tells a similar story. A reconstructed sky father figure, Dios Pater, echoes forward into Zeus in Greece, Jupiter in Rome, and Dios Pita in the Vedic hymns of early India. The same core concept reshaped by each culture that inherited it, but never fully erased. A pair of divine twins, sons of that sky god, shows up independently as Castor and Pollux in Greece, and as the Ashvins in Vedic India, too specific a parallel to be coincidence, across cultures that had no direct contact with each other by that point. None of this means every Indo-European descended culture stayed the same. As the language spread, it fractured into dialects and eventually into entirely separate languages, shaped by local environments and by contact with whatever populations were already living in each new region. Even taboo shows up as a shared inheritance. In several separate branches of the Indo-European family, the ordinary word for bear appears to have been deliberately avoided at some point in the past and replaced with a euphemism instead, an echo of some shared, now untraceable superstition about naming a dangerous animal directly. What survived across all of it was an underlying grammar and a worldview, one built around hierarchy, inherited status, and formal obligation between people, concepts that carried directly into the societies that grew out of this expansion. Today, languages descended from this single Bronze Age steppe culture include English, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, Bengali, Persian, German, and Portuguese, among dozens of others, spoken across every inhabited continent. No other known prehistoric migration has left a linguistic footprint anywhere close to this size. The same migration pattern shows up again, thousands of kilometers to the east, in one of the most politically sensitive questions in the field. In 2018, a team led by Vageesh Narasimhan published a study in Science analyzing genomes from the Swat Valley in what is now northern Pakistan, dated between roughly 1200 and 800 BCE. They found a significant proportion of steppe-related ancestry in these populations, carried disproportionately through the same paternal haplogroup, R1a, found across much of Eastern Europe. Unlike in Britain or Iberia, this ancestry did not fully replace the populations already living there. It mixed with them, producing a genetic gradient still visible today, stronger in northern India and weaker toward the south. That same research found the gradient runs along more than just geography. Populations and groups that traditionally trace priestly or ruling status carry measurably higher average steppe ancestry than groups without that history, a pattern consistent with the same kind of socially structured, male-driven mixing seen in Bronze Age Europe, just playing out over a longer timescale and blending rather than replacing outright. Sanskrit itself supports the same picture. Words like Pita for father and Deva for god sit almost identically alongside their European cousins. Horses, absent from the earlier Indus Valley civilization, appear in the archaeological record alongside these newer populations, along with the chariot, a steppe innovation with roots in cultures like Sintashta, further north in the Ural region, that spread east through Yamnaya-descended populations before showing up in Vedic ritual and warfare centuries later. Even the royal horse sacrifice described in the Vedic hymns follows a ceremonial structure with parallels in other Indo-European traditions further west, the kind of specific cultural continuity that is difficult to explain through trade contact alone. This picture, migration and gradual mixture rather than a single violent invasion, directly replaces an older, now discredited framing, sometimes called the Aryan invasion theory, first proposed by 19th-century colonial scholars, who found it convenient to argue that Indian civilization owed its foundations to outsiders. That version of the story remains contested in parts of India today, for understandable historical reasons covered next. What the genetic evidence actually supports is more modest and more interesting. Not conquest, but repeated contact and mixing between steppe-descended populations and the people already living across South Asia. For most of the 20th century, this entire subject was close to untouchable in serious academic circles, and the reason why matters as much as any single genetic finding covered so far. When 19th-century linguists first reconstructed Proto-Indo-European, the discovery escaped academic circles almost immediately and got rebranded along the way. Its original Sanskrit meaning, simply noble or honorable, was reimagined in 19th-century Europe as a racial category describing an ancient bloodline of conquerors. Writers like Houston Stewart Chamberlain built entire ideologies around the idea that this invented Aryan race had founded all of civilization and later declined through racial mixing, a claim with no genuine basis in the actual archaeological or genetic record, even by the standards of its own era. The real data now thoroughly contradicts that specific claim. The Yamnaya themselves were, by the genetic evidence, already a mixed population, descended jointly from earlier Eastern European hunter-gatherers and populations from the Caucasus region. The very idea of a pure, unmixed ancestral bloodline was fiction from the start, invented decades before anyone had the tools to check it against actual DNA. Nazi ideology absorbed and radicalized this framing directly, turning it into a myth of racial destiny used to justify conquest and genocide. The actual burial mounds of the actual Yamnaya became, in this fabricated version of the story, ancestral shrines for an invented master race that never existed as described. The damage that did to the field was real and long-lasting. After 1945, archaeologists largely abandoned migration as an explanation for cultural change, not because the evidence had changed, but because the entire subject had become radioactive by association. That is a large part of why the pots, not people framing, held on for so long, well past the point the evidence justified it. It took the ancient DNA revolution of the mid-2010s to force an actual reckoning, migration returning to the field not as ideology, but as a measurable genetic fact backed by data, rather than nationalist mythology. That reckoning has not fully settled the matter either. In parts of India today, the political sensitivity around Indo-European origins remains live, tied to real and understandable historical grievances about colonial-era scholarship. And outside academia entirely, fringe political movements have shown a continued appetite for repackaging ancestry research into hierarchies of capability or worth, dressing old ideas in new genetic vocabulary. That history sits directly alongside everything else covered here. The actual genetic story, replacement rates you can measure, haplogroups you can name, disease trade-offs you can test, is precise and interesting entirely on its own terms. It never needed a hierarchy attached to it. That is the part the 20th century got catastrophically wrong. None of this happened the way conquest usually gets told. No named battle, no single ruler, no year anyone marked down at the time. Just centuries of contact, repeated often enough and skewed heavily enough that it still shows up today as a measurable ratio in the genome, extracted from nothing more than fragments of degraded bone. The Yamnaya left no epics, no cities, and no written record of how they saw themselves. What they left instead is stitched into the Y chromosomes of a large share of European men alive right now, into the grammar of languages spoken by roughly 3 billion people, and into a disease risk that still shows up in modern hospitals thousands of years later. No monument required. The genome did the remembering for them, whether they intended it to or not. That is, in some ways, a stranger legacy than a ruined city or a toppled statue would have been. Cities crumble. Statues get pulled down. A Y chromosome just keeps getting passed forward, generation after generation, indifferent to whatever anyone believes about where it came from. Long after the wagons rotted and the burial mounds eroded down to low grassy humps barely distinguishable from the surrounding steppe, the actual evidence kept traveling, inside people, waiting for the tools to finally read it.